Right, it's just about 10 o'clock now, and welcome to today's World Whistleblowing Day webinar. My name's Liz Gardiner, and I'm the Chief Executive at Protect, the UK's whistleblowing charity. And I'm joined today by a fantastic panel. We're going to hear from Azeem Rafiq, who's the former professional cricketer and anti-racism campaigner, about his experiences as a whistleblower. We're going to hear from Nicola Rabson, Linklater's employment partner, and she advises employers on whistleblowing. We're going to hear from Georgina Charlton, who's a former Speak Up Guardian in the NHS and now an organisational change lead, and from Mark Stewart, the Executive Director of Enforcement and Market Oversight at the Financial Conduct Authority. And he's going to reflect on these issues from the perspective of a regulator. And I'm hoping that this is going to be very much a conversation rather than a series of presentations, but we aim to leave some time at the end for questions. So anybody who's in the audience who would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and leave some time at the end to get to them. My apologies in advance if we don't have time to answer everyone's questions. And the theme of today is changing the world, one whistleblower at a time. And on World Whistleblowers Day, we want to celebrate the courage of whistleblowers in speaking up and thank them for the changes that their speaking up has led to. Because too often the only thing we hear about whistleblowers is that they've been treated badly. But as Azeem's story is going to show, there's a whistleblower can bring about very significant changes. And every day up and down the country, hundreds of whistleblowers are quietly pointing out wrongdoing, identifying risks, speaking up to stop harm. And so for all the whistleblowers in the audience, thank you for your courage and for the changes you're making in the public interest. At Protect, we advise around 3,000 whistleblowers a year, and we know it can be a very lonely and stressful journey. And we also know that the personal and professional costs of whistleblowing can be very high. And we'll also hear today from Azeem about the personal costs of his whistleblowing. And those in the audience who work with and for employers, today's also a chance to discuss how we can better support and encourage whistleblowers and protect them against retaliation. At Protect, we work with employers to promote the best practice, and we've recently produced a guide to employers called Preventing Whistleblower Victimisation, and it sets out the proactive steps you can take as an employer. It's on a special purchase price this week, and our thanks to Nicola and to Georgina for their involvement in developing the guide with us. But for anyone new to the story of how cricket woke up to racism, I'll just give you a very brief background. Azeem's professional career began as a captain of the England under-19 team, and he played as a spinning all-rounder at Yorkshire Cricket Club for 2 spells between 2008 and 14, and then again from 2016 to 18. And while he was there, he suffered racism, bullying, and he blew the whistle internally, but he met with very much an inadequate response and denials. And eventually he spoke about his treatment in public in 2020, and that led to a very powerful testimony before the Culture, Media and Sports Committee in the House of Commons. And as many of you will know, his whistleblowing has led to very significant changes, both in the top team at Yorkshire, and indeed today the sanctions that were placed on Yorkshire have been lifted. It's the first time they're able to host international test match at Headingley. It's also led to a very much needed change in culture at Yorkshire and across cricket more generally. Other cricketers have come forward to speak up, and Azeem's now very keen to work with organisations to help root out institutional racism. He's qualified as a coach, but his cricketing career is very much on hold, and the personal cost of his whistleblowing is extremely high. Earlier this month, the ECB, cricket's governing body, has announced charges have been brought against a number of individuals in relation to the racism, and those allegations will be heard later this year. So for Azeem, this isn't over yet, and it's been a long 2 years since he went public with the issues. So Azeem, turning to you, the concerns you've raised about racism, I think, have been very well documented, but today we're really interested in hearing about your journey as a whistleblower in trying to raise the concerns. Can you just tell us a little bit about, where you went to first and how far up the organisation you went to internally, and the response that you got when you did?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think throughout sort of 2017, initially when I reported it as bullying, I went to the coaches, I went to the director of cricket. Throughout 2017, I went to the National Asian Cricket Council, the Professional Cricket Association, Players Association, the ECB. I think I felt like I went everywhere I could, and then finally I went to have a meeting with the director of cricket and the CEO at the time in 2018, and yeah, they got rid of me sort of 7 days later after that. So I felt like I did. I went to everywhere I could to get this resolved in an amicable manner. But when I mean, around, as I think I've spoken about before, in 2018, around the loss of my son and the way I was treated around that, I just said to myself, this is not something that I can take much longer. But even then, I was in no fit state mentally, financially, to be able to speak about it at the time. I left the UK, went to Pakistan. I wasn't really good. I'd planned not to come back, but my wife got pregnant again, and then we came back. And then in 2020, around Black Lives Matter and a few other things that were happening, and a lot of people were getting more brave to speak out, I actually opened a new business, had an interview about that, got asked a question, and I just got emotional. So even actually going and speaking out publicly wasn't really planned, although it was something I wanted to do. I don't know if I would have ever been able to do it had it not happened in that interview.
That's really interesting. So it wasn't a sort of active choice to speak out. You had left this behind to some extent, but once you spoke out, this things escalated very quickly, didn't it? And I think, I mean, what was it, the talking to the press, or was it the testimony in the House of Commons that actually led cricket to start listening to you, and particularly in Yorkshire?
Well, things didn't actually escalate quickly at all. It was August 2020 that I spoke to the press initially. There was a little bit of a media storm, but only within the sporting sort of cricket fraternity at the time. And then sort of, as it happens in these cases, 3 weeks of media stuff, and then everyone gets bored. And then from then onwards, actually, it was painful. It was difficult. Every day I was part of this independent investigation where having to deal with a lot of sort of briefings against me, and it wasn't very independent. So it was a long sort of 18 months, but it was really that when the independent investigation found that the P word was banter, and that article broke in the Cricinfo, I think it was the 1st or 2nd of November 2021, that and then Sajid Javid tweeted that heads should roll and P word is never banter. It was really at that point that it escalated into overdrive, and then got invited to present myself in front of the DCMS committee and talk about what happened.
Right. So along the way, at what point was it that you felt you needed to start an employment tribunal claim? And tell us a little bit about that and the challenges that you faced as a whistleblower in bringing that claim.
Yeah, well, it's the thing that I found the most challenging. We saw initially the independent investigation was announced around September 2020. Initially, the Squire Patton-Boggs and the panel were really sort of felt like receptive, and they were going to listen. When I had my first hearing with them, which lasted 8 hours, I think at the end of that, and their sort of responses and their language changed, and it just felt like they're not going to listen. They've actually didn't feel that there would be any substance behind what I was saying. And when they actually saw there was, it was all about how can we cover this up? And that's what it started to feel like. At that point, I mean, I had an incredible barristers at Doughty Street, and they felt like it would make Yorkshire think twice to cover it up if there was an employment tribunal. As I said, I found that phase incredibly challenging, but in the end, actually, the fact that we had an employment tribunal running was so helpful, because even though in different proceedings, Yorkshire had different responses, and they were finding the challenge of the fact that potentially we might end up in court, really challenging to sort of cover up. And in the end, I think that's what helped me be heard.
Right. I think I'll bring in Nicola here, because you know, we at Protect, we advise people at the point at which, you know, there isn't any other option, you're now going to have to go to a tribunal. But what do you think, Nicola, you know, as a lawyer with plenty of experience at the tribunals, what do you think the challenges are around bringing tribunal claims, especially if somebody's going through the kind of trauma that Azeem was, the kind of stress that they're already under, and perhaps they've just been dismissed? You know, what do you see as the role of tribunals in the whistleblowing space?
Well, before I address your question in relation to what the challenges are, which I think there's a lot of challenges in relation to any litigation, but particularly claimants that find themselves in vulnerable situations, I think it is worth pointing out, obviously I'm a lawyer and I respect the rule of law and I believe in it. And I do think it's exceedingly important that the law makes clear that individuals that raise concerns that are in the public interest should not be retaliated against. And that's for a number of reasons. One, it's making clear societal expectations of what's right and wrong. And two, from a pure managing situations as an individual, it means that it does enable individuals to access discussions with employers, which may not be accessible if the law wasn't there making it clear that employers should not retaliate, should not victimize individuals who raise concerns. In terms of the challenges, unfortunately, there are many challenges with the legal system. People generally aren't familiar. You find yourself in a situation that you think you're doing the right thing, you're raising a concern, you're doing it for the right reasons, and suddenly you find yourself in what is a battleground and then in litigation. And litigation is a really formal process. You've got the law, you've got processes such as disclosure, you've got terminology. I mean, Azeem and I have spoken about this, but terminology that you just don't know. I mean, who knows about disclosure unless you're in the legal world and what that means? Who knows about giving a witness statement, just what a tribunal looks like? And I think often people who are accessing the law think it's going to be this simple process. But I mean, I've got cases I'm acting on the, I nearly always act on the employer side, although I do pro bono for individuals on occasion. But, you know, 18 months, 2.5 years of dealing with formal letters, sometimes in a tone that's not familiar to you. So I think that's where the lawyer is really important, that the lawyer, and I know Azeem had an excellent barrister at Doughty Street who would explain things to him and the consequences so he could understand why he was doing it, what the next steps were, and what the ultimate outcome might be. So that's a sort of high level picture, if you like, of my thoughts.
Thank you, Nicola. We'll come back, I think, in terms of how we can help employers avoid that in just a minute. So, and also, I know there's questions already coming in. So I'll try and add those in as we go along through the talk. Azeem, tell us a little bit about, you know, you said this that the tribunal started people taking you seriously and taking the issue seriously. When you look back on your experience, what do you think has changed at Yorkshire and across cricket more generally?
Well, I think, look, obviously a new leadership, and I really think leadership matters. I think there's obviously been an acceptance, which was the most important part for me, and a real willingness to do the right thing. Have they got everything right since? No, they haven't, and they will make mistakes along the way, but I've always been very clear that all it needs is some acceptance, a few answers, and let's try and work together to make sure that no one else should go through this. I'm a firm believer that support, the balance of support and challenge is really important. And under Lord Patel, there's, like I said, there's been a real desire to do the right things. There's a lot of things still needed, but in terms of tangibly, one of the biggest things they've done, in my opinion, is they've made coaching and kit free for any kids that come into the pathways. Now that's so significant in a game that doesn't have a lot of finances, a club that is not in a good financial state because of everything, yet committing to making the game more inclusive and sort of getting rid of the barriers to entry, I thought was a huge significant step and something all the other counties should learn from and do, but still haven't. And that just shows where sort of people are still at. But yeah, at Yorkshire, I think there's been a lot of big changes, obviously change of personnel. I'm excited for them because I really think they can lead and show the world what can happen if you've got leadership that actually puts humanity at the core of their makeup.
Thank you. I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? That it's not just about the warm words, but it's actually taking some tangible steps to make some changes. Nicola, can I come back to you on how you would advise employers? I mean, Azeem said leadership matters. What is your advice to employers about creating the right kind of cultures where we can prevent the kind of victimisation that Azeem and others have suffered ever going anywhere near the tribunal? What do you tell employers?
Well, picking up on what Azeem says, I always think that leaders are absolutely critical in this, and you see that within institutions. There's those at the top who are doing it from a compliance tick box exercise, and in many ways I'm not criticising that approach. That's better than no approach, but there are those that believe that it's important to ensure that people raise concerns in an open manner, those concerns are heard, and those people at the top speaking out, encouraging it, endorsing it, believing in it, really make the difference in terms of the tone from the top, if you like, is the terminology that's often used, but in creating that culture, because with the best will in the world, if that top tier of people don't believe in it, it's very difficult to cascade it all the way down in an institution. The second thing that I think is really important is training. So often institutions roll out training once in relation to it, and actually you have to roll it out consistently, and the training also has to be tailored for the audience. So there's one thing rolling out training in relation to your processes, your procedures, how people can raise concerns, but that middle management area, who may well have individuals coming to them, maybe not through the formal channels actually, and just saying, look, I've seen this, don't know what to do. The training in relation to how people can listen up as well as speak up, and what you do when you hear something from somebody and where you take it, is equally important, and repeating that training, I think, really makes a difference. I've seen institutions now who do that twice a year for their entire all of their employees, and that I really do think makes a difference. And keeping things simple, not always tagging things as well. You know, if someone raises a concern, yes, of course you've got a process, but from that person's perspective, they don't really care what process is being followed. They just want to know it's being dealt with. Continually keeping that person updated as well is something I see going wrong a lot. So what happens is, if nothing's happening, instead of just saying to the person, actually we are looking into it, but we need to speak to some people, silence is created, and silence creates fear, anxiety, stress, because they don't know what's happening. So just updating people regularly. And finally, obviously we hear about psychologically safe spaces. I think one of the things that slightly worries me about that, I have no doubt that that is important. You can't just create a psychologically safe space overnight though. You can't suddenly come out and say, it's like, you know, it's a psychologically safe space, you should feel able to raise concerns. You have to realise that that is about doing lots of things the right way, and also accepting things go wrong and then addressing things when they go wrong, and being clear that it went wrong, why it went wrong, and changing it. And over time then you will create a space and a culture in which people can raise concerns. And then just looping back to my first point, that's why the people at the top really matter. They have to believe in it, and they have to want to create that culture, that environment for their people to raise issues.
Thank you. I think that's really powerful, and certainly something that we see quite often. And it's often the middle managers that, you know, who haven't had any training in how to handle whistleblowing, that are receiving the concerns. And actually our research says that most whistleblowers are not like Azeem, that keep on raising it and keep on saying, I'm not going to let this go, I do want you to investigate. Quite often people will just, you know, raise it once and then be silent, and then the opportunity to learn from that has gone. And I think Azeem, you said some really powerful things about what's happened in Yorkshire. You also got the regulators involved, and I thought perhaps, I don't know if you've got any comments about what's happening to cricket more widely and the role of the ECB in making the changes, because then I'd like Mark to kind of come in from a regulator's perspective. What do you think the role of the regulator is when, you know, when things are perhaps getting a bit sticky inside the organisation, or things aren't happening? You said you went outside to the regulators. What was the response you had there?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I've been very open and honest about the fact that I knocked on every door possible. I think generally no one wanted to confront the issue. I think a lot of people are complicit in it, so there was a lot of sort of fear around, and I think like Nicola said, and we've spoken about this, that first point of when the allegation comes is so important, so vital. And if that's dealt with in a more humanly manner as opposed to a risk management strategy, because sat on this side, I couldn't care less what processes that is going on. I really couldn't. All I wanted was someone to listen to me and talk to me as a human about what might happen moving forward. So yeah, I mean, look, I tried to raise it everywhere. I wanted this dealt with without the car crash that we ended up in, because I knew how damaging that would be for everyone involved, and that saddens me. There's people suffering, I'm suffering, but there's a lot of people suffering through this now because of the fact that no one wanted to deal with it and show some leadership. In terms of, obviously, at this stage now, ECB has, after DCMS, they did start an investigation and recently concluded that with some charges, but it's start of another process. I think this is like the fourth process that I'm going to be part of, and where it ends, how it ends, I'm not really too sure. I think we've seen recently in football that the independent regulator is going to come in. I think we're not far away from all sports to having independent regulators, because I really don't understand how you can be the promoter and the regulator at the same time. So yeah, a lot of challenges ahead, but it's interesting to see where the game will go over the next 6 to 8 months.
Thank you. And Mark, perhaps we could bring you in here and talk about, you know, the accountability that regulators can hold organisations to account for when they, you know, when things have gone wrong, changes are introduced. I mean, the ECB is going to be looking across cricket, hopefully, and checking that not just Yorkshire, but all the cricket clubs are taking serious action to address racism in cricket. But what do you see as the role of regulators more generally in preventing and deterring the kind of victimisation that Azeem suffered?
I think, thank you, Liz. I think the first thing I'd say is listening to Azeem, you know, what a great story and what a great achievement you've achieved so far in your whistleblowing. I think it's a very powerful anecdote that I think affects all of us and really should inspire a lot of whistleblowers that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And you know, the story exemplifies what I think is a truism about the whistleblowers that we deal with, that the vast majority of them are enormously committed to a real public interest in doing what they're doing. And I think that's a really important part of the whistleblowing experience, that you have these very strong, conscientious and inspiring people who bring their concerns forward, both within the firms they work for, but then ultimately they bring them to us as the regulator if they feel as though they're not being heard or listened to properly. And I think what we're able to do as a regulator is that we're able to provide that independent and objective assessment of what's going on. We're a point where a whistleblower will be listened to, and we have set up systems and controls ourselves to ensure that we are able to deal with whistleblowing concerns when they arise with a specialised team. And we have created rules and standards and obligations on the firms we regulate to deal with whistleblowers properly and to ensure that they're not victimised, they're listened to properly. And if they're not, then those rules are broken and we can take action against those firms and against senior managers as well, against individuals who don't do the right thing by the whistleblowers under our rules. So I think there's a very important role that we do play in supporting the whistleblowing function and whistleblowers specifically in relation to the concerns they've got. The tension here, of course, is that not every whistleblowing concern has a happy ending, because not all of them, in a sense, check out completely. But it's important that we have a function that is able to objectively sit in the middle and not be complicit in whatever might be going on within the firm, nor complicit in holding back the whistleblower from those concerns being expressed. And we have a system in place to ensure that we do listen and we act on every whistleblowing concern that we get. And that's I think that's an important venting for whistleblowers who don't feel as though they're being listened to properly within their firms.
I just wondered if you'd also touch on that bit about the feedback that Nicola raised, the idea that, while you think you've told the regulator, you need to know what's going on with the investigation. How does the feedback work at the FCA?
Yeah, so I mean, I heard Nicola say that. I agree completely with what she said, that whistleblowers need to get feedback. I'll concede this is quite challenging because there are other rules that we have to follow which make it difficult for us to give that complete transparency to whistleblowers about what we're doing with the concerns they've raised with us. There's provisions in the legislation that apply to us that mean that we have to keep firm information confidential. And that means keeping it confidential in our discussions with whistleblowers as well. So we can say things like, we're looking at what you've raised with us. We've taken that up with the firm. At the moment, we can't tell you much more other than we're acting on the information you've given us. And we've looked at ways in which we can, in a sense, interpret the restrictions that are placed on us in a broader way, so that we can say more to the whistleblower. But at the moment, that's not really possible. I think what I'd say about that problem is we're trying to create as much transparency to whistleblowers as we possibly can, whilst at the same time complying with the rules that apply to us. But I think this is an evolution, and the way in which whistleblowing in the financial services sector has evolved, particularly over the last 5 years, evolved based on the experiences of whistleblowers, is helping us to improve and amend our own processes so that we can do this better in the future. We are going to have to ask for some law reform, though, in order to be able to be fully transparent to whistleblowers, because at the moment, the law doesn't allow us to be.
I'm just going to throw a question at you that's coming from the audience about what the role of the FCA is when it comes to employment tribunals. Often when you're going to a tribunal, you'll tick a box and say, yes, I want the regulator to be informed about this whistleblowing concern. Does the FCA get invited to give opinions to employment tribunals? Is that right? Or is that's what somebody's asking us? Is there a protocol around FCA being involved when a whistleblower in the financial sector?
The rules that we've applied to firms we regulate require the firm to tell us when an employee or former employee takes the firm to the employment tribunal and there is a whistleblowing issue. So we do know about it, but we don't give opinions and we don't get involved in the employment tribunal process, because that's entirely in the hands of the employment tribunal itself. The employment tribunal is the adjudicator, not the FCA. And I think sometimes it's difficult for whistleblowers to understand that we're not the arbiter here. We can't impose our own judgment. That's a matter for the employment tribunal to really decide.
Let's move on with another question about more generally about the approach of the FCA, because I think you're one of the regulators that is expressed a very clear interest in tackling toxic cultures and workplaces. And whistleblowing, perhaps even 5-10 years ago, would not have been, racism, sexism, bullying, harassment would not have been seen as whistleblowing. But I think the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movements and so forth have allowed us to join the dots and see the bigger picture. What's the FCA's view in terms of these kind of toxic workplace cultures? Tell us about that.
Culture is a very important part of the compliance obligation across all the rules that we set, including the rules that we set in relation to whistleblowing. I agree with what Nicola said about tone from the top. Tone from the top needs to generate tone from the middle, and tone from the middle needs to generate tone from below. In a sense, there's we see a very strong coalition between whistleblowers and senior management in firms, because both groups, in a sense, have the firm's best interests at their heart. The whistleblower has concerns about what is happening within a firm that is not right, and senior management should be absolutely committed to ensuring that what's not right is looked at and fixed if it's not right. So that should create a very powerful cultural alliance between whistleblowers and senior management. We've tried to capture that in the rules that we've set for firms, which require large firms to have what we call a whistleblower champion, who is usually a member of the senior management team of the firm, who has the obligation to ensure that the firm is properly bringing integrity, independence, and effectiveness to its systems and controls around whistleblowing. And that should have send a cultural message within the firm as well, that senior management really prizes whistleblowing and takes it seriously. Now, in good firms, we see that happening, and that's clearly having a very beneficial effect. Of course, we want to make sure that that's always the case. And in a sense, we're a backstop for ensuring that's always the case, because if it's not, we will investigate and we'll take action against the firm. So the cultural piece, I think, is absolutely core. And the message from us is senior management and whistleblowers should be on the same side. Even if they disagree about the merits of a particular concern, the functions should be on the same side.
And I think, we've done some research about whistleblowing in the financial services sector, which sadly says that still we see far too many whistleblowers do say they've suffered detriment. And I think, there's some fantastic rules that are in place, but obviously it's the cultural piece that we've still got to tackle, and perhaps those champion roles are really important. Just before we leave the regulatory sort of discussions, Azeem, there's a question that's coming from the audience, which was, of all the bodies and the individuals that you approached, and you've said you went internally, you went externally, you went to the governing bodies, the question is, was the lack of action from the NACCC perhaps the most disappointing aspect? Perhaps you could explain, what you were expecting from them and what their role was in this.
Yeah, look, the National Asian Cricket Council, I was at an event and a couple of their representatives were there, and I just felt like it was an opportunity for me to, as you mentioned earlier, some whistleblowers will just mention it once and then leave it. I felt like it was an opportunity for me to mention it and hope that I get some support. They just looked the other way at the time. And look, this is a very complex issue, and I'm a very emotional person, and throughout this whole issue, the support I've received has been mainly from white people, and the support Yorkshire received throughout to cover this up came from my community, and that hurts. And that's something that I need to speak about more for people to understand the complexities of this issue and how it becomes institutionally racist. There's a lot of layers of protections, and some of them come through these community and faith organizations, and that is the truth, whether people like it or not. And we need to integrate as opposed to going up and setting separately, because we live in a data world, and the data shows from since 2014, when the NACCC started, to today, there's been a drop in professional representation of South Asian cricketers. So it's either not working or whatever they're doing is not the right thing. This is my point about the game actually taking some tangible steps of, because they've got to be a bit more brave in handling this stuff, and setting up on your own and going and sort of saying, oh, well, there's this funding and go do stuff with South Asians. Although the funding should be there, I don't think it needs to be done separately. It's very much about integrating for me. But yeah, going back to the question, I think without doubt is the thing that hurt me the most.
Thank you very much for letting us hear those views. And I think what you're pointing to is, the complexities of the cultural change piece, and that it does take a very long time, and the work that Yorkshire's doing now with kits for young cricketers is going to take decades to see the change that we want to see at the top. And maybe I could bring in Georgina at this point to talk about another organisation that faces deep-rooted challenges, which is the NHS. like the financial services sector, the NHS has introduced a long time ago these freedom to speak up guardians, of which Georgina is one of the pioneers in that. People at the top of organisations and people pushing for change in the organisations. But I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the challenges that the NHS, Georgina, still faces when it comes to preventing victimisation and the blame culture issues that we hear so much about.
So I think, firstly, the NHS has been under and is under a huge amount of pressure. So, of course, the pandemic hit us like a wrecking ball, really. So, the NHS is under constant pressure. So there were, pandemic pressures, and some of that is, pressures from our regulators around financial and performance targets. Of course, pre-pandemic, elective treatment, etc. Waiting times were long, and they have just spiraled as well. So we have internal pressures as a result of that as well. So, vacancy, sickness as a result of that. And I think all of these pressures combined with a tired workforce that probably don't feel wholly motivated, unfortunately, that's where poor behaviours then start to come to the forefront. And some of my reflections are they become more prominent. So I'm not saying that they weren't there before, they just become more visible, I guess. And we all know the impacts of poor behaviours on patient safety, on staff motivation. And there's a great bit of work that some people might know around Civility Saves Lives is the campaign by Dr. Chris Turner, who talks a lot about acts of incivility and the effects that has on people, on bystanders, and then the outcomes associated with that. So the NHS is under huge amounts of pressure. We've mentioned a couple of times middle managers, and honestly, like, my heart goes out to people that are having to respond to the top-down external, internal pressures of an organisation, and the unhappy staff, and it meets in that middle, and huge amounts of pressure, I think, come from that. So I think we're in a difficult situation. And when it comes to victimisation, so, I was a Speak Up Guardian for 4 years in a very big, complex organisation, and victimisation can be really obvious and it can be extremely subtle. And sometimes people don't even know that they're doing it. Simple things like shifts, rotas, giving people less favourable shifts, or not treating people equally or the same. And there are times where I've gone to managers and said, like, this person has raised something with you, and now they seem to be doing, the worst shifts of the lot. And it's not until you call that out do people realise that some of this is actually unconscious. Some is very conscious, but some is also unconscious. And Liz, you talked a little bit about culture, and we've mentioned culture numerous times, I think, on the call today. And when I think about culture, I always try to describe it as the written and unwritten rules of an organisation or a team. Or, as we all know, it's just the way that we do things around here. So some of the written things, great to have a whistleblowing policy, tick box. But actually, what happens in reality? So what is happening in teams, and what is that narrative that goes with that? So that lived experience. I speak to many teams that somebody raised a concern and they were treated differently as a result of that. That stops everybody else in the team speaking up. There may be a policy, but the actual culture that's underpinning that, bubbling up, it is an automatic shutdown. We're not going to speak up. I've watched that person do it. And I'm sure there will be people looking at whistleblowers and thinking, oh, I don't think I can do that because look how this person is being treated. And I guess being open about what victimisation looks like in practice, and part of the guide we developed tries to articulate a little bit about that. You say these words like victimisation, detriment, and it means different things in different organisations. I think it's really important that we are open about what that looks like in reality. But also, not all cultures necessarily for Speak Up are negative, and I hopefully get an opportunity a bit later to talk about some kind of top tips. But actually, if you get it right, it has such a positive impact on, if someone raises a concern, when they feel listened to and they can see that action was taken, that sends that ripple effect out to the team that actually it's okay to speak up here, and that, you know, we're all have the same purpose in healthcare and other sectors to do the right thing for the people that we look after and we care for. So why would you not want to know if something's not going to plan? And I always try to quote at this point something the aviation industry talks about, is speaking up should be, it should be seen as a gift, a valuable gift of information. It should be seen in a positive light rather than a negative light.
Now, that's a really powerful thought as well, that you're bringing a gift of information, but in return, the employer has to be a good receiver of bad news, because quite often, you know, almost inevitably, whistleblowing brings, you know, I'm raising something that's difficult, it's really hard to hear. And we need to acknowledge that a lot of, well, I think it's a natural human reaction to respond badly to criticism. And we need to explain to people the importance of listening and the impact that can have. I'm just going to turn back to the idea of, you know, whistleblowing as a success. And Azeem, can I come back to you and say, you know, you've spoken a lot about the personal cost in various media about that you've experienced as a whistleblower, the threats, the abuse that you've had, and indeed the impact that it's had on your mental health. So despite the personal cost, do you think that your whistleblowing was a success? How do you characterize that?
Well, I'm determined to make it a success. That's how I characterize it at this stage. I think everything that myself and others have put themselves through for me to be heard, I'm very determined that in 5 years' time we can look back at it and say we played a small part in it, in the game becoming more inclusive and a better environment for everyone. Someone said to me a few days ago that whistleblowers don't have a positive life after. And I'm determined to change that twofold, not just for myself, but for everyone else to think, actually, no, we can speak up if there's not something right, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm determined to make it a success. At this stage, as I said, there's people are trying. I think there's snippets of the game that accepted things have not been right, but there's a hell of a long way to go, and I want to make sure that yeah, we go through that journey together and make sure at the end of the 5 years I can look back and go, you know, it was worth it.
Case, because I think, you know, as Mark was saying, I just echo, you know, it seems from those of us looking outside that you've made a huge difference already. I mean, what would be your takeaway for employers? What do you think they should learn from your experience? What would be your message to them? And then I'll ask some of our employers to kind of come back on that and see whether they agree.
Yeah, look, I mean, as I said earlier, that even there's no perfect organization. There will always be concerns and allegations of different types, and I think that initial first point of contact when them allegations come, handling them in a humanly manner, less of the risk management, more of actually dealing with the human, I think that will help, because most people speak out because, one, they want a few answers to put their puzzle back together, and they just want to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and they want to make the place that they love better. And I think if employers see that a little bit more, then that'll be really helpful. And I think, you know, you talk about creating safe spaces and stuff, they're not just tick boxes. And I think that again comes right from the top. And I was part of an event a few weeks ago where I talked about how leadership in a room, how you don't realize when you talk about lived experiences, how much lived experiences you have within your own room. And then the owner of the firm talked about about his upbringing and that he had dyslexia, and him sharing that with his employers. I mean, it's been a difficult couple of years with COVID and the challenges everyone's faced. And if leadership can be a bit more human and talk to their workforce about some of their struggles, I think inevitably that's going to allow some of the workforce to think, well, you know, I'm going to be heard. If I'm not feeling all right, I can go and talk to my boss because he talked about, or she talked about how much they've been struggling mentally. So I think it's just creating that sort of safe space, but with actions as opposed to a tick box and words.
I'll ask Georgina to come back on that in just a second. But I also think you said something so important, that whistleblowers are just trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. And they're on the side of the employer because it's the organisation that they're trying to support. You know, that's the place that they love. I thought that was a really powerful thing that you said there. Georgina, what would your top tips be for employers if you if they're starting on this journey? And I think Azeem's been really powerful about saying, we're not going to get it right in one go. We all make mistakes and we're all human, but that and perhaps making whistleblowing a bit more of a human, humanizing it in some way might be helpful. But what's your reflections on the role of employers? What first steps would you get a trust to take?
Oh, there's so many good top tips that I feel like I can share, having done this for a period of time and also led the London region of Speak Up Guardian. So there's a variety of things that I'm going to say thick and fast. So some of them will hopefully chime with you. Some may be achievable, some not. So we've talked a little bit about a safe person, an independent person. I think Mark talked about a whistleblowing champion. Of course, the NHS has a mandated role as a Speak Up Guardian from October 2016. So they are seen as an independent, impartial person within an organisation where you can go to raise concerns. And sometimes I've raised concerns on behalf of individuals anonymously. So sometimes it can act as an additional layer to protect. I was one of the first full-time guardians on the patch when it first kicked off. And that was a really strong message from our board to say this is really important and we're putting resource into that. But I am one person, and our organisation, if you know, Guys and St Thomas's, has grown very fast in the most recent years. So we are now about 24,000 employees. So I can't do this, or I couldn't do this by myself. So what did I do? I built a team of what we call Speak Up advocates. And we actually have a similar role, which is called an inclusion agent as well. So there are people that sit within the business, so in teams, in departments, who have had special training about how to raise concerns, including how to connect with the Guardian, etc. So you need to have people that are approachable, that look like you, that you feel safe talking to. So not only do you have this individual who sits and works at a senior level, you have people infiltrated all the way down to the front line to try and keep that communication working. I think Nicola talked about training for middle managers. Really interesting and very difficult read if you read the Ockenden review of maternity services. One of the recommendations is about multidisciplinary training, and actually this is something that I did a couple of years ago in maternity services, where I taught training for how to escalate concerns. But the critical thing in that was it was multidisciplinary. So you have potentially the people that are speaking up and those that are going to answer the concerns in the room. And that is where you agree a common language for this. So my challenge would be great to train managers, but actually how can we also train the people that may be speaking up? So we're talking the same language, and that certain words are flagging like, okay, we've got a problem here and we can do this together. So if you can get training which is more inclusive, I've seen real benefits of that. Some about visibility. So if you go into Guys and St Thomas's Hospital, on the desktop, every PC desktop in our organisation has details of how you can speak up. It's on there permanently, and every so often you'll see a photo of the Speak Up Guardian, which isn't me anymore, it's my colleague Eve. So that brings that human bit in. So I'm not just an email address, I'm a face. And there is some legacy posters of me loitering around the organisation. So if you ever go there for a hospital appointment, look out, because my face is still on some of those notice boards. And that was to say, this is who I am, come and speak to me. I am a human, I'm not an email address, I'm not just a name, I am who I am. And I used to get out and about all the time to wards, departments, meetings, team briefings, etc. So really getting out there and speaking to people. Something about looking at the data that you already have. So in the NHS, we have a big staff survey, but actually we collect Speak Up data that gets published nationally. So what is the data saying? You know, Speak Up data at the moment, I think is quite interesting. There's been some decreases in concerns raised about bullying, harassment, and a decrease in those speaking up in the NHS that have suffered detriment. I don't believe it. It doesn't make sense. You can't have an increase. And so I think you've got to take some of this data with a pinch of salt, but then look at it and think, okay, how can I still collate even more information? So we ask people as they exit our organisation, are you leaving as a result of speaking up and you not being listened to? So capturing information, every part of your organisation, if you can, to try and collate what that picture looks like around your culture of speaking up. And I do want to talk a little bit about integrity of senior leaders, because I think we've talked a lot about leadership matters, you know, that the tension between something being tick box versus really believing and getting under the skin of it. And I always quote Brené Brown when I talk about integrity, and it's about doing what is the right thing, not necessarily what is the most comfortable thing. So if you can get leaderships at all levels within organizations that demonstrate that integrity, that actually the right thing to do is this, but it's really uncomfortable, that's the right thing to do. And how do we support leaders in that uncomfortable journey when you have concerns raised and you're not sure? And then the final thing I just want to talk about, which Nicola raised, is around psychological safety. So of course, this builds over time. This is about trust. You know, we know, I always describe trust as like a jar of marbles. You know, every trusting interaction you have, you put a marble in that jar, and it's very easy to knock that over and you have to start again. So psychological safety, I think, is absolutely critical in teams where they feel included, so they can bring their whole selves to work, and that could be to do with the protected characteristics, etc. They create that learning environment, that it's okay to make mistakes and learn, and to also challenge when things aren't right. I think there's a lot of evidence emerging around team effectiveness. So Google did a great bit of work around, you know, psychological safety being one of the foundations and pillars of creating really highly effective teams, is that culture where people feel able to speak up. But it's a long game, psychological safety, and definitely something to read further into, and how you create that, because there are simple words that you can say, simple things in meetings or in interactions that build that culture. So there's a whole array of different top tips, and I think, like I said, depending on your organization, what resource you have, there are some really small things that can do really simple, and then some bigger, some kind of bigger examples of things that you can do.
Nicola, I'm just going to ask you, because we're running out of time quickly now. So what your initial, I mean, would you perhaps reflect on what Georgina's just said there? I mean, where do you get employers to start with this psychological safety? And I thought that integrity of senior leaders point is quite, I mean, it sounds good, but how do you demonstrate your integrity as a senior?
Well, I mean, that's hugely challenging, and I actually don't think any advisor can affect that change independently, if you like. I think it's about making sure that discussions, excuse me, my dogs are speaking up at the moment. You know, making sure that at board level discussions are frequently had about this, getting these topics on the agenda. I mean, as Mark was talking about earlier, I genuinely believe that SISC 18, which is the rule that the FCA put in place, and the whistleblowers champion, I think just having that senior person, having to identify a senior person as a whistleblowers champion within those institutions, did create a difference. But ultimately, as the advisor, you can't drive those changes. It has to come from within. It has to be the people on the board of directors that want to create that cultural shift. And like I said right at the beginning, you have to believe in it. From a legal perspective, one of the only additions, because Georgina has just run through a brilliant list of things that can be done, is one thing that I would ask everyone to do who's involved on the legal side, is not see people simply as a legal risk or a regulatory risk in the event that they do raise a concern. And that is something that I do see, because to Georgina's point of leadership, it's at all levels. And it's very difficult when someone is raising a concern which you have proximity to, or you may think that you've been involved or endorsed or in some way may taint you or your colleagues to actually do the right thing. And it's too easy then to put them in the, this is a legal risk, this is a whistleblower for the purposes of PIDA, therefore we have to manage it in a legal way. Actually, my view on that is, if you deal and manage these things, if you deal and manage these things properly in a genuine way with integrity, following the right processes, as a result of that, your legal risk almost certainly diminishes, both from a pure legal perspective and also from an individual perspective, because as Azeem has spoken about, Azeem didn't want to bring a legal claim, he wanted to be listened to and to drive change. So that's the other point I would make.
I think that's really important. Thank you, Nicola. In terms of we do often talk about whistleblowers as, you know, your most effective form of risk management, but there are human people behind this, and treating them as a risk and categorising them as a risk. We miss that human side that Azeem's been talking about so powerfully. Mark, do you want to come in with some sort of final thoughts from the regulator's perspective about, particularly around that role of leaders, the kind of carrot and stick approach that perhaps the FCA as a regulator can have? One of the things that one of our questions has been asking about rewards, for example, you know, should we be actually looking at regulatory rewards more as an incentive to speaking up? Do you think we need more people? Is it about incentivizing whistleblowers, or is it actually just about getting the systems working better?
I mean, let me deal with the first part of your question first, Liz. I certainly think that it's really important that we have a clear, transparent system for managing the concerns that whistleblowers have got, and that system includes the role of a regulator who can independently assess and take action in relation to whistleblowers' concerns, including taking action against firms and individuals where there is clear evidence the whistleblower has been victimised because of their whistleblowing. I think it's only through mechanisms like that that we create the right kind of culture for whistleblowing to exist as part and parcel of a normal way of working, and to ensure that whistleblowers have the right respect and status within firms as well. On the issue of rewards and incentives, the FCA doesn't have a formal view. I've got a personal view about it. It's more of a concern around the way in which a reward system encourages law enforcement agencies and regulators to focus on what might be called the high-end whistleblowing, and ignore what might be called the more ordinary whistleblowing that we receive. We get about 1,000 whistleblowers every year. Most of those issues are concerning relatively technical issues or small issues within a firm that might become big if they're not addressed quickly. So the value of the whistleblowing from a regulatory perspective is that it allows things to be nipped in the bud before they can become bigger issues or more damaging issues or more harmful issues. I don't think a reward system is consistent with that kind of approach to whistleblowing, where every single whistleblowing complaint gets looked at independently on its merits. I think a reward system encourages regulators and law enforcement to sort of pick and choose the high-end whistleblowing complaints that they then take forward and look at. And I think that's what we've seen in those jurisdictions where rewards are paid to whistleblowers. The vast majority of people who blow the whistle to regulators in those jurisdictions actually don't get their concerns looked at all, because the process is all about finding the valuable ones, not all of them. So I think the approach we take here is a really important one, because it means every whistleblower gets listened to, every whistleblowing concern gets looked at on its merits, and more often than not, those concerns allow us as a regulator to nip harm in the bud, which is exactly why the whistleblower wants their concerns looked at in the first place.
Nip the harm in the bud for you, Azeem, if they'd listened to you straight away. I mean, I think we'll just leave you the sort of final word if you want to give a takeaway message to our audience. And we've got a really broad audience of whistleblowers, of people working in all kinds of different sectors, people working with and for whistleblowing teams. I mean, is there a message that you would like to leave them?
Yeah, look, I mean, firstly, just to all the whistleblowers out there who are still struggling and living with the consequences of being a whistleblower, look, in solidarity, and we all know what it's like. So yeah, thinking of everyone. In terms of the employers and people on here, as I said, it's time to make whistleblowing seen as a positive thing. In terms of something I didn't mention earlier, even if we're going to actually do something tangibly, the tribunal and the 3-month sort of out of time thing. That's something that we've got to try and push to get changed. And let's make together our workplaces and our environments, and in effect our society, welcoming for everyone, regardless of who they are. And I think we've all got to play a part in it. And I do feel like we have the biggest opportunity I can see that we've ever had to make our society a better place, and we've all got to play a part.
Let's say another word, because you've just left us with the most beautiful way of finishing this World Whistleblower Day webinar. All I can say today is thank you, Azeem, Nicola, Georgina and Mark, for your really interesting contributions today. Thank you to all the whistleblowers out there for speaking up, and to you, Azeem, and to all of you who have the courage to do so. And we're getting loads and loads of comments in from our audience saying thank you very much. It's been a wonderful World Whistleblower Day webinar. Okay, and we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks.